So we're in chapter 18, section 2 of your American history book, onto the great age of enterprise. And so in this chapter, part of the chapter, I should say, section, we're going to learn about inventors, the triumph for free enterprise, the rise of big business and corporations. So here we go. And so we're going to talk about some of these guys. And these, for the railroads, we have Cornelius Vanderbilt. We have Andrew Carnegie in steel. We have John B. Rockefeller in Standard Oil. And then we have J.P. Morgan involved in banking. And these guys have become captains in the industry, monopolies, and some good and some bad. But we'll be going into each one of these in this section. So let's begin. The blessings of industry. Okay, of course, in America, now we have the clothing manufacturing, where now they were manufacturing ready-made clothes as you go in and hiring a lot of women too in the midst of making these clothes and sewing and stuff in the midst of these big factories. They were packaging cereals, as you see down here, canned food commercially. And now we'll find, in fact, everything now is in the midst of this new age of industry. Inventors at this time. We're going to go over these three inventors, which were very important, so you need to know about them. First of all is Alexander Graham Bell. You're right, the telephone, huh? He lived 1847 to 1922. Thomas Edison. He lived 1847 to 1931. When you think of Thomas Edison, who do you think of, or what do you think of, I should say? The light bulb. Saying here, what? Our greatest weakness lies in giving up. The most certain way to success is to always try just one more time. One thing about Thomas Edison, we'll know that he was on to working his work ethic. He constantly worked. And everyone that of one of his employees worked hard. And that's how he thought hard work came to what inventions that came through Thomas Edison. And then we have Nikola Tesla. We're going to talk about him. We're going to talk about his because of the AC current and on to a lot of, he was actually above his time in developing energy and such. Very much of a genius, but almost to the point of craziness, you know. And we'll talk, he's one of the inventors we'll talk about. He actually worked under Thomas Edison, and Thomas Edison let him go. He paid him very poorly. And in the midst of all this, he's such a great genius, you know, inventor. So let's talk about Alexander Graham Bell first. The talking telegraph. What is the talking telegraph? I hope you know the telephone, right? Well, about Alexander Graham Bell. First of all, he was a native of Scotland, and he came and moved to America, you know, in the midst of a time of persecution in England, of course, but he moved to America. He focused on helping the deaf. In fact, his wife and his mother were deaf. And so he loved to study about sound transmission and trying to develop something to help the deaf, like hearing aids and such. So he studied sound waves, and he believed that sound waves could be transmitted over a telegraph cable. And he had that in his mind, thinking, how can we transmit sound over these cables instead of just telegraphs, instead of just dots and dashes, right? In 1846, he then invented the first telephone. It's actually invented by accident, as he was in the other room and he was putting together as in the midst of this telegraph, and he had spilled something on himself, and he said, "Watson, come here, I need you." And Watson, actually his colleague Watson, heard him over the lines of the telegraph, over the cable, and thinking, wow, you know, can sound be transmitted over a telegraph cable? So in the midst of all this, he demonstrated this now at the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia in 1846. Of course, many people thought this was like a toy, like, what in the world? You know, they didn't really think that the telephone that he had put together would be anything special. But in fact, in the midst of all this, Western Telegraph Union, remember the Telegraph Union now is sending telegraphs, even across the Atlantic Ocean and all over in the United States, we have telegraphs, but they refused to buy the telephone, thinking it was kind of a joke or something. But at the exposition in Philadelphia, a lot of people, they thought this is something of the future. In fact, Lord Kelvin, when you think of Lord Kelvin, a great scientist that we know a lot about when you're studying physical science and such, basically said that when he went to America, he came back and he went to the exposition there in America because it was a world exposition. And he said, the most wonderful thing I have ever seen in America is this telephone. So he saw that he was so intrigued, a scientist so intrigued in the telephone being a thing of the future. Bell, Alexander Bell and his inventions. He not only invented the telephone, but he also invented some other very important things that we have. First of all, he was into this metal detector. So he initially came up with this device because he wanted to locate bullets inside of different people that had been shot. And one, the assassination of President Garfield, which we'll be talking about. So President Garfield had a bullet lodged in him for many months. And so Bell put together, Alexander Graham Bell put together a metal detector to try to locate that bullet. But because it was so close to, the springs in the bed, and sort of just did not work. And President Garfield ended up dying after 6 months into his presidency. But just over the summer, he ended up passing away. But the metal detector was invented. Also, the photophone. A photophone allowed the transmission of speech on a beam of light. And so Alexander Graham Bell thought of that. The graphophone, and this is an improved version of the phonograph. And he could record and replay back sound on what? Phonograph or record player, right? So the audiometer, this gadget was used to detect hearing problems. Remember, Alexander Graham Bell was really into helping the deaf since his wife was deaf and also his mother was deaf. The telephone. So we have it there at the Exposition of Philadelphia, at the expo there, we have them showing these telephones. Everyone thinking, oh, this is fun, like a toy, But the Bell Telephone Company formed, Alexander Graham Bell formed his own company in 1877. In 1880, 3 years later, there were 150 towns and cities that had local telephone systems. In 1895, there were 300,000 telephones. In fact, the Western Union, when you think of Western Union, was a telegraph. He tried to compete with Bell Telephone, and it was held up in court, in fact, in the midst of the Western Union did not want to have anything to do and was competing with the Bell Telephone, but they basically said, yes, Alexander Graham Bell, the Bell Telephone Company, can, go in and sell telephones, put together telephones, and bring in telephones to different cities. In 1900, there were 800,000 telephones. And later on, AT&T, American Telephone and Telegraph, formed and consolidated with Bell Telephone. So when you see AT&T, AT&T was Bell Telephone. So I like this here, Thomas Edison again. One of his sayings of Thomas Edison. When you think of Thomas Edison, what do you think of? I always think of the light bulb, don't you? It's because one of the greatest inventions at this time in the world would be a light bulb. Everyone had to sit in the dark when the sun went down, right? So, but Thomas Edison always says genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. What does that mean? That genius takes a lot of work, and it takes a lot of perspiration. That's working. When you perspire, you sweat. It takes a lot of sweat, and it's only 1% inspiration. You're inspired by 1%, but to make that 1% inspiration come true, you got to do a lot of work, perspiration. So Thomas Edison, he's one of the greatest inventors in history, and he was almost deaf. In fact, he had a hearing problem, and he said this hearing problem made him concentrate more on his inventions. And so, again, he's concentrating on these inventions, having 1% being inspired and 99% work. He was a very much workaholic, I would say. In fact, he lived in New Jersey, and that's where his first modern American laboratory. So he put together a whole laboratory for invention. So in Menlo Park, New Jersey, they called him the Wizard of Menlo Park. I wonder why they called him that. Well, when you think of all the things he invented, it was almost like, wow, he's putting together things we cannot even imagine, especially light, right? And Thomas Edison never really claimed to be a scientist at all. He was a technological genius, of course, but he said basically a lot of times he would take ideas or inspirations even from other people that had the inspiration and put together it in his laboratory after times and times and times of experiments to make it happen, right? So he put scientific principles to practical use. He patented over 1,093 inventions in the United States. Some of these common inventions were the phonograph. Remember we put together the phonograph? Actually, Alexander Graham Bell had a first type of phonograph, but he took that and put it into our modern phonograph. Motion picture cameras, mimeograph machine, improved telephone system. He took Alexander Bell's telephone, improved on it. So a lot of inventions he had were improvements in what they already had. But lo and behold, the most famous invention that Thomas Edison had was the incandescent electric lamp, the light bulb. And this is being the most profound invention, probably one of the most profound inventions in all of history. So in 1882, Edison Illuminated Company, they called him Edison Illuminating Company, was his company, and he set up a power station in New York City, of all places, and he gave light for 85 customers in New York. Well, these customers were mainly very wealthy businessmen. In fact, he brought light into the New York Times office, the newspaper office, so they had lights. And J.P. Morgan, one of the richest bankers in America at that time, bought some of these electric lamps and wanted to invest in them. And in 2 years, 508 customers. Well, that's still not that much compared to how many customers we have now. But in 1898, remember 1882 to 1898, there were 3,000 stations, electrical stations in America. And so they established these manufacturing companies, and at the end of the 1880s, there were 1 million incandescent electric lamps. 1 million. So it grew. People wanted to have a light. They had to use fire torches at night, right? They had to use candles. And now they would be able to use a lamp, electric lamp. This would be so, so important, especially in America. And it would go worldwide. Thomas Edison. Then we have Nikola Tesla. I have to say that Nikola Tesla was one of the greatest minds in American history. He was a Serbian immigrant, came actually out of poverty to America. He came to work under Thomas Edison as he was engineer, scientist, inventor, such. But Edison thought he was basically kind of crazy, which he was in many ways. He would have dreams about certain things, dreams about electric energy and all these things. And not only that, he had lost his family members. I was thinking his brother, I think it was, that passed away, that affected him such that he would be very forlorn a lot, And so anyway, he worked to improve Edison's DC. All of the lamps were on DC current, which is direct current motors, which were, pretty, compared to what we have now, they were more dangerous, I could say, in the midst of all that. But he found what was called alternating current. Now, I'm not going to explain that all to you here, but alternating current was safer and cheaper method. But Thomas Edison did not approve of Nikola Tesla. And even after he brought forth this alternate current, Edison let him go. And after Nikola Tesla left, he became in such poverty. He wasn't really paid very highly at all by Edison, that he even was digging ditches for a time. But then he partnered with another entrepreneur named George Westinghouse. Have you ever heard of Westinghouse? Westinghouse lived during the Civil War. He was an older gentleman then, and he invented what was called the air brake. And the air brake was for the railroad cars. So the railroad cars would be able to brake for themselves. So inventing this air brake, every single railroad car needed it. So he became very, very wealthy. But he saw Nikola Tesla in the midst of in his AC current invention, looking at the electrical current that he was putting together and thinking, wow, this may work. This is way better than DC current. So Westinghouse got together with Tesla to compete with Edison's General Electric Company. And so now Westinghouse with Nikola Tesla was competing with the greatest, man at that time, inventor, Edison. And what happened, especially at the Chicago Exposition, when they brought in and showed these types of currents, that there was basically a war on currents. And it came to pass in Chicago that they wanted Nikola Tesla's AC current over the DC current. And so this was becoming very much to figure out what type of electricity do you want. And looking at Nikola Tesla's, his was better at this point. In fact, J.P. Morgan took together on the war of currents in the midst of all this, and brought in with Tesla to build a power plant to use the power plant in Niagara Falls to support his electrical current. And Tesla also invented the Tesla coil for radio transmitters. He actually lived a long life, and he was in friendships with J.P. Morgan, which happened to be Morgan and Edison considered him very, they thought he was like a schizophrenic. They thought, oh my goodness, Tesla, you can try to put some of this stuff together, but he has wild ideas. And he did have quite a few wild ideas. But, his Tesla coil, we actually use now for radio transmitters onto electric motors. Wireless communication now was thought of with Nikola Tesla. X-rays and many other. Mark Twain loved his inventions. And so Mark Twain listened to him. You think of Mark Twain, he was a writer, right? But he was interested in what Nikola Tesla was doing for the future. Nikola Tesla had some weird thoughts. He basically said he had a particle beam that could destroy armies of people, And then the weird thing is that he couldn't pay, because he became in poverty at times. He couldn't pay for his hotel at that time. So he said, I have this invention. And he gave him, I said, do not open it. And it was basically telling what a particle beam that would actually influence the whole world in the future. Well, we don't have that particle beam right now. whether he had it in his mind or what. He also believed in these little remote controlled boats that would become all over the oceans at a certain time. He saw these, and he also was believing that he was receiving information from Mars. So there's a lot of different things about Nikola Tesla, but the greats, not only Edison, but also J.P. Morgan, in fact, I think Tesla was very good friends. You saw the movie on him. He was very good friends with J.P. Morgan's daughter, but in the midst of all that, they considered him kind of eccentric, you can imagine. So, Tesla. So I am going to stop there and go on to this last part, the triumph of free enterprise, because we're going to talk about some big enterprising gurus. A lot of times they're called robber barons in the midst that came into being in business at this time. And there's a few of them. We already talked a little bit about the steel industry, the oil industry, and on to the banking system. And the triumph for free enterprise was called capitalism. And it was an economic system where individuals are free to follow their economic pursuits as they see fit. And the free enterprise system was to make something of yourself. And so sometimes some people very genius, I should say, entrepreneurs, or in the midst of this, have become very, very wealthy. And so let's stop there and I'll go on to the next video.